Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to We Were There. I am Judith Pucci, and I am a Tribute Museum walking tour guide. We at Tribute, all of us have a personal connection to the attacks of September 11th. We are family members, first responders, survivors. Some of us, like me, lived down here in Lower Manhattan. Others of us were here during the cleanup period. All of us, therefore, have stories that go beyond the historical events of the day, and they explore much more the personal costs of September 11th. So today you're going to be hearing from a responder and a survivor. And next to me is Stephen Kern, and then next to Stephen is Marty Nystrom. Now, Marty was an emergency medical technician for 23 years. He contributed to the rescue effort after the attacks. Marty arrived at the Trade Center at about 2 o'clock that afternoon, and he stayed for 4 days. Stephen is an attorney. On September 11th, he worked for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The Port Authority, among its many other duties, the Port Authority is the agency that manages the World Trade Center. Its offices then were in the North Tower. That was the first building to be attacked. You're going to hear, though, first from Marty, so I'm going to just take a couple of moments to very quickly set the scene for you. One of the phrases that you will probably be hearing is the pile. The pile refers to the broken remains of the World Trade Center. Steel, glass, rebar, concrete, everything that was once the 7 buildings of the Trade Center is now a broken pile of wreckage. That is the pile. The rescue effort took place on the pile, and it began just hours after the attacks. Working on the pile was dangerous. Digging through the pile was dangerous. Injuries were inevitable. Marty and his EMS team, their job was critical because what they were here to do primarily was to tend to those who were on the pile, to give them the medical care they needed when injuries took place. And it's all yours, Marty.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Judith. My story revolves around, obviously, the rescue and recovery efforts. I am summoned here by the New York City Office of Emergency Management because my team is certified in hazardous materials and confined space rescue. Unfortunately, 2 big ticket items needed here on 9/11. Upon the response here, I turned in my names and my ID numbers to the command center and was told to wait a few minutes. And after that, somebody came up to me and checked everything and said, "Is this you?" And I said, "Yes." You'll be going to the northeast corner of the pile where there are rescues and recoveries being attempted and people are getting hurt doing it. And then they're being brought back through the pile or the edge of the pile to the command center to get medical help. I want that stopped. Here is a radio. We'll give you 2 ambulances up on Broadway. Here is your code numbers. Go and do your job. Oh, and by the way, if you're not busy medically treating anybody, dig through the pile like everybody else. What? Yeah, are you in charge of this unit? Yes, I am. Well, I need to brief you. So I step a few moments away from my team, and the gentleman says to me, "Listen, there's 500 missing firemen right now. There are 100 missing police officers. If you're not busy taking care of somebody medically, dig through the pile like everybody else because these people have not checked in and we can't find them." So that's what we do. We go to our location and we start doing our deal. And throughout the course of the day, there were sounds being heard. One of those sounds I heard, besides all of the construction equipment and the axe digging and the pickaxes, are what we call a personal alert safety system. They're about the size of your cell phone, and rescuers who go into hazardous situations like this usually keep them on their belts. Firefighters, if you know a firefighter, his or hers are integrated into their air packs. So when they turn on the air pack, you hear a chirp, chirp, and off they go. During the course of the day, there was a lot of noise and a lot of yelling and screaming because of all the noise, so we really couldn't hear anything. Toward the end of the evening, it was decided that it was a totally uncoordinated effort from civilians. What does that mean? It was not just police, fire, and emergency medical that showed up here that day. It was construction workers, iron workers, people with cranes, bulldozers, and trucks to help the first responders. And unfortunately, that part of the effort was uncoordinated. So it was decided by somebody at some point that at midnight, all of that stuff gets shut off. Bring it down to the ground, leave the key in the ignition, we'll start at first light. And that's when we could really hear what was going on, unfortunately, under our feet. And those personal alert safety systems from all the firefighters and first responders that were in the towers are unfortunately going off now. And they're making a heck of a racket. And the unfortunate thing about that all is that they were underneath my feet. And I couldn't see them. And I couldn't help those people. And as a first responder, that's a horrible slap in the face. It is dejecting, it is demoralizing, and it is just, forgive me, it's just god awful. So now you have to remember, as Judith just said, I had 23 years of service altogether. 18 years of service prior to 9/11, so I have 18 years of ghosts on board. Then you have to add the 9/11 ghosts after that. So by 2003, I'm a stark raving lunatic. I'm drinking, I'm drugging, I'm doing things I shouldn't be doing, and I'm generally just being a big pain in the rear end to everybody. It took an offhanded comment at one of my barbecues from a family member who happens to be in the audience today. The older kids were teasing the younger kids. And I said to them, leave them alone. That's what they do. The older always tease the younger. Leave them alone. That's normal. It's a normal thing to happen. And my niece looked at me and said, what do you know from normal anymore? And I had to take a step back. And that comment stuck with me the rest of the day and in the weeks that followed. And I did go get help. And when I went to go get help, that was scary too, because instead of being a mature person in a mature office, it ended up being a young lady. And in my mind, I get the diplomas. But what could she know about my trials and tribulations of life being a young lady? So I started to back out of the office. I'm like, I'm not doing this. And she pulled out a piece of paper and said, did you sign this piece of paper looking for help? And I said, yeah. She goes, well, if you leave now and don't get help, I'm going to have to go back to your superiors in town hall or village hall or whatever, and they're going to make you come anyway, at least just once. So how about you just come in and sit down? And so I did. And I went back 26 more times. Because as you guys can all see here today, I'm much better now. Thank you very much.
Marty was told that 500 firefighters were missing and 100 police officers. In terms of the final count for deaths, you may know that the number of New York City police officers who died that day is 23. The number of New York City firefighters who die is 343. And the number of Port Authority police who die is 37. The number of first responders who die on September 11th is greater than any non-military first responders who have died in a single day in the entire history of the United States. And it was 441. And all of them died here at the World Trade Center. The pile. Before there was the pile, of course, there was the World Trade Center. It was 7 buildings in total. The Twin Towers were just the 2 famous ones. 50,000 people came to work at the World Trade Center every day, and one of them was Stephen. At 8:45 that morning, Stephen was at work on the 62nd floor of the North Tower, 8:45. At 8:45 in New York City, everything was absolutely ordinary and normal. At 8:45, the only thing exceptional about September 11th was the weather. It was a superbly beautiful, memorably beautiful day. 1 minute clicks by, 1 minute, 8:46, that is when our world changes, because that is when hijacked Flight 11 is flown into that same building that Stephen is now in, and it goes into floors above where his office is, and it's on.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith. So the North Tower of the World Trade Center was kind of my home away from home for almost 20 years. I worked at various floors in the Trade Center where our headquarters were. On that day, 9 of the 13 people who worked with me were in at 8:46 in the morning. We were on the other side of the building from when the plane went in, so we didn't see it coming. All we knew was at 8:46, suddenly there was a bang, a loud roar, and the building started shaking violently. So violently that several of my coworkers lost their footing and fell to their knees. The shaking seemed to go on for a good 20 to 30 seconds. When it stopped, I yelled to everybody to get out into the hallway and go down one of the 3 staircases that went from the top of the building to the bottom, obviously the nearest one. I stood at the entrance to the stairwell. My intent was to count the 9 other people and make sure that they went down ahead of me. We had no idea what had just happened. We had no idea how serious it was. But if the building shook, it was serious. And I thought that if I got out from whatever this was, if I saw all 9 of them go before me, I could assume that they got out. I stood there for a few minutes and I counted at least 8, but I wasn't sure that I had gotten all 9 of them. So I decided to go back into our suite of offices and start individually searching the cubicles, the file room, the conference room, and the various offices. So I did that, and I was about halfway through when I came into the cubicle for my secretary. Her name was Rose. And I walked into her office, and sure enough, Rose had not left. And in fact, Rose was underneath her desk on her knees. And she looked up at me with eyes as big as plates, and she said, "It's an earthquake." I said, "Rose, I don't know what it is, but look outside your window. What do you see?" There's hunks of metal and wreckage and glass and Lord knows what else coming from somewhere above us. Something happened above where we are. And not only that, I don't really think it's that important what happened. I think the important thing is that we need to get out of here. So I half dragged her out from under the desk, and then about halfway to the stairwell, she decided that was probably the best thing to do, and so she went down ahead of me. The evacuation took much quicker than it had 8.5 years earlier when I was also an intended murder victim at the bombing of the World Trade Center. That day it took me 3.5 hours to get out of the building. On 9/11 it took 50 minutes, 50 minutes to get from the 62nd floor down to the ground floor. You have to keep in mind we didn't have smartphones 16 years ago, so we weren't getting real-time information. We had little texter devices, if you remember, that got little yellow text messages on them. Well, somebody got a message about 10 minutes into the stairwell saying that a plane hit the building. And the reaction in the stairwell was kind of murmuring, like, "Oh, gee, you know, that's kind of odd. How do you hit something that big?" But people were more concerned about getting down the stairs. In real time, 17 minutes after our building was hit, the other plane from Boston went down to the Statue of Liberty, made a U-turn, and flew north into the south face of the South Tower. Again, we didn't know it, we didn't even hear it, even though we weren't that far away distance-wise. But then somebody got a text message a few minutes later saying that a plane hit the other building. And now the reaction in the stairwell was very, very different. Now you heard people gasping, and some people started crying, because now everybody was starting to realize this was not an accident. We were under attack. As I say, things moved fairly quickly until we got to about the 20th floor. The stairwells were only wide enough for 2 people. And at the 20th floor, we saw our first firefighter going up as we were going down. And so the rest of the trip down, we had to go single file, because now Port Authority police and firefighters were coming up on the other side to evacuate the building. It slowed down again at the 10th floor. Something had happened to the sprinkler system on that floor, and water was pouring into the stairwell. So for the last 10 floors, it was kind of like we were walking through a waterfall, because there was water with us the rest of the way. Got down to the plaza level, but instead of leaving the area, I decided to go to the Port Authority's police headquarters. Now, the Port Authority police again, we had our own police force that provided security for the building, and I was familiar with many of those guys. I worked with them for 20 years. In any event, their headquarters was 1 level below ground in the shopping mall that was all in the area beneath the towers. So I went down to their headquarters, 1 level below ground, and I was there for about 10 minutes. And at 9:59, there was suddenly a huge roar. And the building where even though I was 1 level underground, was shaking. The ceiling tiles where we were was falling on us. The little bit of emergency lighting that we had went out. There were only about 5 guys with me, because most of our police were in the building trying to get people out. But the 6 of us ran as fast as we could for the exit, but it was blocked by debris. And so we did what Rose had done an hour and a quarter earlier. We all dove underneath desks or got underneath door jambs, hoping that that would protect us from whatever was happening. Well, we didn't know it, but what was happening was the south tower, the second one to be hit, but it was hit on an angle, it collapsed first, and that's what was happening right then. If it had toppled, as the terrorists were intending, I wouldn't be here talking to you. But fortunately, if you saw it on TV, what you saw was the towers pancaked down. It took 11 seconds for a 110-story building to come down. In any event, we didn't know any of that, but when the shaking stopped, the most noticeable effect was the dust and the debris. It was I could not see from me to the front row at this point. But once I took stock of myself and realized I was still alive, I needed to figure out a way to make my second escape of the morning. We had some advantages being in the police area. They had a huge axe, which one of the guys used to pry open the door to get out. They had a water cooler. Why was that important? This was another lesson learned from the bombing 8 years earlier. If you think for what's in the air when a 110-story building collapses, it's not good for human lungs. Silicone, asbestos, pulverized glass, pulverized concrete. And so I told everybody, before you leave, you've got to get out a handkerchief, or you take your shirt off, or get a newspaper, anything that absorbs water, go soak it in the water cooler and put it in front of your mouth so that you had at least a makeshift filter to breathe through. Many people have died because of their exposure to what was in the air in the day and months that followed at the Trade Center. We got outside. Fortunately, there was no debris that we couldn't move or walk around. Finally got out to the street at the northeast corner of the site at Church and Vesey. I started walking towards City Hall, and I walked 2.5 blocks before I could see the sky. That's how big the debris cloud was that I was in. When I could see the sky, I looked over my shoulder to see the towers. I could see my tower still standing. There was a huge multi-storied hole in it with hot flames pouring out of the hole. I looked over to the left where the south tower should have been. It wasn't there. And so I think for the first time, my brain was figuring out what must have happened while I was underground. But my goal now was to try and find a phone that worked, since most phones were not working, either public or mobile phones. I needed to get a hold of my wife, who has her own story to tell of her morning, wondering whether I made it or not. So I walked in a northwest direction, and at 10:28 in the morning, I was 6 blocks due north of the Trade Center site when I heard that terrible roar for the second and hopefully the last time in my life. And this time, even though there were buildings between me and the site, this time I knew what was happening. This was my tower coming down. So I ran to the nearest street that looked south, and what I saw was the end of the north tower coming down, and then a very, very weird sight, which will be with me until I die. I saw hundreds and hundreds of people running toward me away from the site, probably as fast as they've ever run in their lives, being chased by this giant multi-storied cloud, which, because of the canyon effect in New York City, was being pushed through the city, between the buildings, and it looked like it was alive, like it was after them. It was a very, very weird sight. Leaving out a lot of detail in the interest of time, I finally found a phone at 11:30 that morning at an abandoned subway station and got a hold of my wife, who, when she answered the phone referring to the bombing 8 years earlier, I said, "I think I ruined another suit at work today." And she said, "I'll buy it too." And even 16 years later, I can't say anything more about that phone call. It was very poignant. I got on one of the first trains out of the city very late that afternoon after walking all over the place trying to get information, finding out what was going on, and oddly enough got home at about the same time I would have if it had been a normal workday. We lost 84 people in the Port Authority, 37 police and the rest civilians, 4 people from my department, but I'm very, very grateful none of the 9 who worked for me, they all survived, including Rose, although she had a very, very difficult time dealing with the aftermath. And so I do these tours in memory of those 84 colleagues because I was this close to being number 85. Thank you.
And I'm sure you all know that the memorial outside is the national September 11th memorial. The ones in Pennsylvania and at the Pentagon deal exclusively with those two attacks. So as the national memorial, it means that every person who is murdered on September 11th at the Trade Center, at the Pentagon, in Pennsylvania, on a plane, in a building, their names are listed here. They are remembered and honored here. We are opening this up now to all of you. We truly enjoy when this is more of a conversation. So, what would you like to know? The boys are very happy to answer your questions. We have one ground rule. You must not be shy, okay? Good, I'm glad you find that humorous. I appreciate that. So you asked the first question there, laughing sir. Who's going to be bold and brave? We always need somebody to start things off. Oh, there you are, good. Do you want me to do it?
The architect of the building, Mr. Minoru Yamasaki, was actually afraid of heights. And he didn't want, God forbid, something like this to happen. He didn't want the buildings to teeter-totter on people front or back. And he did his research and found that in the late 1940s, the Empire State Building was accidentally struck by a military plane. And you can look it up online. There's a B-24, I believe it was, got lost in the fog out of Roosevelt Field in Long Island on a training mission and ended up crashing into like the 96th floor of the Empire State Building. So there had been a history of accidents with skyscrapers in New York City. He didn't want that to happen to the World Trade Center, so he actually designed the building to implode on itself, and that's exactly what it did on 9/11.
When I started with the PA, it was only 12 years after the towers opened, and many of the engineers who worked on the towers were still employed by us at the Port Authority. So I used to talk to them about the towers. So this is secondhand because I'm not an engineer. But they told me that the towers were built very differently for skyscrapers, especially for the 1960s. Most skyscrapers have their weight in their core, but the Trade Center buildings were built with their weight on the perimeter. It was very, very different, so that if you walked into an empty floor of one of the towers and looked around, you would not see any columns. It was column-free office space. Very odd for the time. What that meant was that when the first floor finally gave way from the heat, and the weight above it was too much for it, you saw the skyscraper pancake since the weight was on the perimeter. Thanks.
Who else?
No, the gentleman's question goes back to the work on the pile and the pass devices, the personal alert safety systems that were going off. Unfortunately, I got to dance around this. Unfortunately, the firefighters fell too far down for us to actually get to them. There was a significant rescue of firefighters on the survivor stairwell, but that was it, unfortunately. That was it. It was very frustrating. It was very frustrating, and we were looking for, to be honest with everybody, we were looking for a lot more we had no idea. Okay, let me just back up a second. On the morning of 9/11, the city elders determined, instead of having 50,000 people in two different towers, there was only 17,000 to 17,500 people. So let's take into account that for a minute. Let's take into account that the New York City Police Department, the Port Authority Police Department, and the City Fire Department of New York City got 15,000 people out of two doomed towers within an hour. And the many fire marshals, as Steve spoke about, and Steve as well, all that time. So to lose 2,000 people, to 2,749 to be exact, most of those people were on their way out at the time. So you guys are adults, you can add what happens up next. And we were expecting a lot more casualties because we knew how many people were in the towers on a regular basis. And when we got there, there was just chaos and mayhem.
The number of people who could actually be rescued afterwards was 18, 1-8. Of them were, I believe, almost 9, maybe 12 of them were actually uniformed people. And so the rest were civilians. So the civilian savings were very small. The last person to be saved was a 30-year-old woman. She was found beneath what used to be the North Tower. And when Janelle was taken from the pile after having been buried alive for 27 hours, it was a little in the afternoon of September the 12th, that was it. It remained technically down here for several more days, a rescue and recovery effort. In reality, it was all recovery. No one else was saved. So it was 18 people. Yeah. It took just, how long did it take to clear the pile? It took just shy, several days shy of 9 months. All of the debris was taken, it was put basically onto barges on the Hudson River, and it was taken to Staten Island, one of the 5 boroughs of the city. There's a very large landfill on Staten Island, and it was taken there. And it was gone through repeatedly there by the FBI and the New York City Police Department over and over and over again, looking for remains and identification. So that's where all of the material was taken. We have time for one more question, if there is, please.
After you were given your assignment, stop and dig if you had time. Was there time, or in what type of rescue?
There was time. That's where the chirping comes in. During the early part of the rescue and recovery efforts, people were getting hurt, and we were tending to them. But it was in those moments that we were idle, where you hear things and see things that you don't want to remember. And the chirping did not stop. No, to clarify, on a good day, with a brand new pass device and a brand new battery, 6 to 8, 9 hours. And once that goes off, so does your hope of finding anybody alive with that. Not that you won't find somebody alive, but their hopes of finding somebody are pretty much
Marty,
are very diminished.
Without being overly graphic, though, I mean, first of all, you didn't find anyone alive.
No, unfortunately,
Okay.
I did not.
And then you did find human remains.
Multiple times.
Okay, I think that is probably
Is that what the
this
question was?
gentleman is.
I'm just wondering what percentage versus treating those versus actually digging, and what type of rescue?
Gashes, lacerations, believe it or not, a concussion or two, and then the unfortunate aftermath of well, not necessarily respiratory that day.
Not there, yeah.
A lot of people came in with respirators or some kind of, the breathing device on, which is why one of the reasons I'm not sick. But the other reason is I was only here for 4 days too. The people that are getting ill are the people that were here for hundreds of days.
Yeah.
Whether they were paid first responders or volunteers, their lives are on the line now because they came down and lent a hand.
It's the exposure constantly, day after day after day, that wound up being just critical for so many people. If you have further questions, because very often as you're getting up, you think, oh, I wish I had asked this. The boys will be right outside the exit, so if you wish to continue this, they will be very happy to do so. Thank you all. Thank you. You chose to spend some of your time with us. We appreciate it.